to Ingenious Genealogy. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about something that I've found I've reappraised in recent weeks, which is using oral histories in genealogical research. And the reason why I've kind of reappraised this is because I think sometimes as family historians, we all at some point at the beginning of our journey will either have interviewed family members or perhaps went into it later in life because we remember hearing stories in our childhood from maybe grandparents or great uncles, great aunts, old members of the family, where we kind of heard these larger than life stories that we kind of wanted to know, is there any truth in them? And I think we're all kind of aware of those stories that we kind of heard and thought these are a little bit too larger than life and they're probably not true. And once we kind of dug into it, we kind of realised that there wasn't an awful lot of truth to some of these stories. And I think as a consequence of that, we sometimes have a bias against using oral histories because we're kind of aware that there are times where it's not entirely accurate. And I think I've been guilty of not always taking oral history as seriously as I should, because when I start to reflect on my own family stories that I've heard, the vast majority of them actually, when you think about it, are correct. I mean, when I started on this journey, I would talk to older relatives, and really my research got going because of them, because they gave me correct details about births and places of birth and surnames. So really, I was started off, the whole basis of my tree, of my research, is oral history. And then even looking at the kind of more wild tales, there's always an element of truth to them. I'll give you an example about my great-grandfather, who was in the British Expeditionary Force in the Second World War. He was in France, he was on the Maginot Line, and we know that because he took a piece of the Maginot Line and carved in the date that he was there. Now, the family story that I'd been told, and this was from a great-uncle telling me that another great-uncle had told him, that my great-granddad had told him, that he had ended up being chased down a cellar in Belgium by German soldiers. And I have to admit, I have never found any evidence to confirm that. But then there wouldn't be evidence really to confirm a story like that. What I have discovered is, based on the date on which he is at the Maginot Line, that he's carved himself on this artefact that's been passed down, he would have been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the Germans arrived in France. And looking at his military papers, it is clear that he was not evacuated at Dunkirk. He was, you may not know this, but Dunkirk is the famous one, but there were other evacuations that happened along the north of France coast in the weeks following Dunkirk. So it's very clear that he was in a sticky situation when France was occupied, when the occupation began, and he would have found himself having to take an alternative route further west along the French coast to get home. So what this tells us then is that while we can't verify that story, oral history has a place, because there was some truth, and that truth was he was in a bit of a situation during the evacuation. So recording that, and I must do a video on this at some point, but recording that, because I'm writing a book about him at the moment, I make it very clear that there is a family story which says this, and then I go into the facts that we actually know. And I think that's really important with oral histories, is it's making it clear that this is a story that we've heard, and we can kind of go into the details, we can go into the facts around it, but I don't think we should ignore them. I think it's important to preserve these stories and then give the context, research as much as we can. But I think sometimes we kind of fall into that trap of not listening to them at all and not giving them any worth. And I'm going to talk to you today about why I think that there is definitely worth to taking oral history seriously. So obviously trying to define what oral histories are, I've kind of given my own definition here, which is they're testimonies passed on by word of mouth. So it could be a story, it could be some facts, it could be an interview that you've done with someone, and obviously over time these can be recorded using various media. I was very lucky in that I have found local histories where I had like a great uncle who was interviewed for a local history back in about 1900, and his words have been preserved in this book, which is fantastic, talking about his childhood. In more recent years, I have conducted interviews which I've recorded on CD. So you can record them in various media. Of course, it's so easy now with phones and things to record things as MP3s, etc. For humans, we've been passing stories down by word of mouth far longer than we've ever written records down. So it really is a very old tradition. But I think, again, it's something that's not viewed as favourably since written records began, because obviously if you've got official records that people have written, and there's less likely to be errors, because if someone's written a record 1,000 years ago, the day, and as long as it's the original document that you're reading, it's just the same as the day it was written. Whereas if you've had, 40 people have to pass it down over 1,000 years, there's a chance that it's not as accurate when it gets to you 1,000 years later. So the written form, provided it's the original, because obviously a transcription, there can be errors there, people give more credence to written records, and that's fair enough. But again, and I'm going to go into this later, I don't think we can completely rule out the usefulness, the power of oral histories. Especially because, and I'm going to go into this later, different countries begin using official records at different points, different societies. For example, in Britain, in England in particular, parish registers began around 1530s. Not all parishes go back that far. However, what that's telling you is that you can get back that far with written records. Whereas in Ireland, civil registration doesn't begin for the whole of Ireland until 1864, which means that there are some parish registers that you can kind of go back to maybe the earlier 19th century, but they're far from complete, whereas they are mainly complete in England and Wales, kind of back to the 18th century. So straight away you've got two neighbouring countries, you've got England and you've got Ireland, with very different starting points as to when official records of kind of the mass population begins. So oral histories there can come in more handy, for example, in Irish genealogy than in English, because whereas in English genealogy you might have more records to verify things, in Irish you might need to start listing a bit more. And this, I'm half Irish, I'm going to go into that later, how useful it's been for me, with kind of not only providing you with information, but also steering you in the right direction in your search for written material as well. And of course, it's not just when records begin, but also from when records are available. You may find that censuses have a 100-year closure in certain countries, or 75-year closure, etc. Same with death certificates, marriage certificates, birth certificates. Access to all of these varies from country to country, and so you may find that for certain countries that you're researching, or certain societies you're researching, it's oral history that you need, because you actually can't get that information via an official source because the record is closed. Now, before I go any further, I'm going to do a video on this at some point later. But I just want to clarify something here, which is that I see genealogy, I feel that genealogy is to historical research what metal detecting is to archaeology, in the sense that obviously archaeologists and historians are the professionals, they are the experts, and we as genealogists and metal detectorists are hobbyists, but we are no less interested in the field and have an awareness and a knowledge of the field. And often we can pave the way and point the way, in our case to historians, for metal detectorists for archaeologists. It often happens at night that a metal detectorist will come across a find that will then pinpoint the archaeologists to come in and do a professional and accurate excavation. But they've paved the way. This great army of hobbyists who kind of do their own research, know what they're doing. They can pave the way for these archaeologists, professional archaeologists, to come in. And I think it's the same with us as genealogists. I think we underestimate the fact that we are often creating these big data sets that don't exist. When you think about history, we often think about history in terms of political history, don't we? We think of the grand sweeping events of history with monarchs and noblemen and wars, and it's really political history. And yet, for the vast majority of the population, for the vast majority of time, they weren't at these events and they don't represent their lives. And I think we're talking here about social history. And the reason why it's so difficult past a certain point to do social history is because the record sets aren't as central or easily accessed as they are for kind of the big sweeping events of history. You think about how many newspapers there are across the country and sitting in archives that kind of give you rich social history. But in particular, as I mentioned earlier, in England, for example, back to the 1530s, we've got these parish registers. Certainly in the 18th century, you find people recording occupation of the father. Now, across the country of England, there are these county archives full of parish registers, all recording the vast majority of the population's occupation as far back as the kind of the mid-18th century. And I'll go through this probably in another video, but basically these are all in different archives. But the second we start uploading our trees and our own research onto the various family history websites, we're suddenly creating a data set in one central place that didn't exist before, that can be mined then by experts to start digging into it. And I'll talk about this again, as I keep saying, but it even records migration patterns. So you're looking at across people's trees, well, actually, there seems to be a movement to the cities, maybe a generation earlier than we previously thought, that kind of thing. So I think we underestimate ourselves sometimes about how important it is to get our research right. And I think that's really important to clarify. The reason I was saying this is because we have the power as genealogists to make this really rich collection of trees that provide social history. And it's important that we get it right. And I'm making that clear now because, as I said, oral history, it's not seen as being as reliable as written history. And that's understandable. I understand that. I'm going to try and talk today about, I'm not saying that it's as reliable, but I am saying that just because it's not as reliable, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a use. But I want to clarify at the start, before I delve into this, that I do think it's really important as genealogists that we aren't just going on what we've heard and going on stories and our research being a work of fiction, because we are researching real people who lived real lives, and it's really important that we honour their lives with correct information, but also that we are kind of also honouring the past by reflecting societies that maybe haven't been as well preserved as other societies. So that said, let's get into how I think oral history can really be useful for us as genealogists. So obviously, as I said earlier, starting out, it can be really important. Local history, societies, it's really important. Getting a sense of place. Like I say here, we tend to use official written records then to prove the stories. So we don't tend to just base a whole element of our research on an oral history. We'll kind of look in, it directs you as to where you need to go. So if you're told that your ancestor was at a certain battle in the First World War, well, you then start to look through the available records for the time to see if you can verify that fact, and then that becomes the primary source. However, you might then, as I said earlier, want to, in your written version of that story, give a bit of the oral history in there as well. It's certainly worth recording who told you that, what they said as a source, if that is your only source. And again, I must do another video on sourcing, but if people can look at your research and realise that actually your only source is an oral history, then it kind of gives them that push to then themselves verify that with official written records. Again, as I mentioned earlier, certain parts of the world may need a great emphasis on oral history. Certain societies, depending on when official records are available for the cultural society that you hail from in your genealogy, certainly oral histories are going to be really important if there aren't written records past a certain point. But yeah, and as I said at the very bottom here, I think we need to have a more open conversation about how valid we consider oral histories to be in genealogy, and that's why, please use the comment section here, because I really want to start this discussion about oral histories, because I'm about to go into a case study in a moment about how important it's been in my own research, and how useful it's been in pinpointing me in the right direction. So are oral histories reliable? Well, I'm going to give you, before I go into my main case study of this video, I'm going to give you a mini case study, and that's about Frances Hare, who is a distant ancestor of mine. She is a sister of one of my direct ancestors. And in the 1851 census, she gives her place of birth as Swinhope, which is a village in Lincolnshire. However, I won't go into the details, but I know from my own research that she was actually born in nearby Cuxwold, which is another village in Lincolnshire, and she was baptised here. So why has she put Swinhope as her place of birth in the 1851 census? Well, let's consider this. The 1851 census is a primary source only for certain things. You must be really clear that while it's an official document, the only thing we can absolutely be sure of is that we know exactly where she was on the date it was taken and who she's staying with. That's all we know for sure. We can, I guess, look at occupation data and trust our ancestors. But again, all we know for sure is that they were in that house on that night. And it's a reliable primary source for that. But I think with any record, you cannot just take everything it says as being absolutely accurate, because you will find from census to census there's going to be details that should be the same that change. So you've got to be really aware of that it's only a primary source really for the exact moment it's capturing. So for things like when and where she was born, it's a secondary source. It's only as reliable as the person answering the question. And as I'm sure you know, our ancestors weren't always reliable. So really, when you think about it, the 1851 census is kind of a recording of her oral history. It's a recording of what she said about where she was born, about her childhood. But it shouldn't be discounted just because it's not correct. We're not going to discount that information because it actually tells us something really important. Because I can tell you that she moved to Swinhope when she was 7 years old. So what that tells us is that while she was born in Cuxwold, we know for a fact that she grew up in Swinhope. So either she was so young when she left, because I think she left when she was about at least 3, if not 4, to move to Healing before she even moved to Swinhope. So she either doesn't even remember living in Cuxwold, or actually what this reflects is the fact that she feels like she's from Swinhope. So just because it's not entirely accurate in terms of it being her place of birth, it is telling us something about her, something deeper. And I think, again, I'm going to go into this in this video on planning, but we can really start to analyse these sources in deeper levels. I think sometimes we as genealogists kind of just see these collections and think, oh, we know, okay, this is the 51 census. I think we forget that these weren't created for us as family historians. These are historical records, and actually we need to analyse them and study them in the same way that any historian would analyse a document that they'd find in an archive. So really, the 1851 census, despite being an official record, is just as accurate as actually asking her herself where she came from, in that sense. So the reason why I'm giving you this example is to kind of make it clear that many records that we have are preserving oral histories. And I think it's important to consider that. Mainly because I'm not saying that this makes them equally valid, because it doesn't, because obviously someone talking about their own childhood to an enumerator in the 1851 census is not the same as you hearing fifth hand from someone what happened 100 years ago. But what it does tell us, as you can see at the bottom, is that we can apply my analysis of this source to oral histories, using that same high quality analysis to extract what we need and to use it alongside other sources. The 1851 census, I have not analysed it in isolation. I have used her baptism. I have used 4 of her siblings' baptisms, their census records. I built a story here using different sources, and I think oral history, rather than just discounting them completely, play a really crucial role in enriching that wider research that we have. So here's my case study for today. So James Warmington is my 4 times great-grandfather. He lived in Armagh in Ireland. He lived from 1798 to 1894, and we know about him through various written sources: his children's marriage certificates, his own death certificate, his will, and various land records from across the years. Now, I wanted to get further back, but as I've said earlier, from when he was born, there are no records in existence. There's no records, so he predates written, mass written records of the population in Ireland. It's before parish registers in his area. It's before civil registration. There are written sources for Irish history. Don't get me wrong. But and if you've done Irish history, family history, you'll know this, for most family historians, it's really difficult to get past that date. There's very few collections that exist that you can reliably use to help you. So I did a bit of a case study, because Warmington's quite a rare surname anyway. And I kind of looked to see how many Warmington males there were in that generation. And I worked out that if you fast forward to the 19th century, to the dawn of the 20th century, and look at all the Warmingtons living in Ireland, there aren't many. And if you trace all of their lineages back, they can all be traced back to roughly 12 males living in County Armagh in Northern Ireland. So there are 12 Warmington males, as far as I can tell, who end up being the ancestors of all the Warmingtons in Ireland 100 years later, 12 of them. So that means I've doubled that to 24. So there's approximately 24 Warmingtons in that generation. If you kind of say, well, they were the boys, but there would have been girls as well who we don't know. Their maiden name was Warmington because it predates registration. So think about that. It's 24 Warmingtons, and they're all living in the same region of County Armagh. Well, you think, well, they're not going to be siblings, are they? But thinking about the average number of children at the time, they're probably going to be cousins, aren't they? Which means that they've all got a common set of grandparents who were probably the first Warmingtons to arrive in Armagh. And Warmington seems to be an English surname, and they were Church of Ireland, which would suggest that they came from England. So it looks like his grandfather, and also there are 3 James Warmingtons of the same generation. So again, that means there's at least 3 brothers, if not 4 brothers, that they all descend from. So 24 children. Maybe from 4 brothers, they all had 6 children each, roughly. It fits the time. It fits the patterns of the time. So, with that in mind, we need to start looking at, well, what is available. So, as I said, I suspect that there's 4 brothers, maybe, that they will descend from. Obviously, there'll be sisters as well, but 4 brothers to pass that Warmington name on. Now, I then come across, because I'm looking for historical records at the time, and there is a recording of a Joseph Warmington, who in 1766 is recorded in the religious census of Ireland. He's living in the exact same part of Ireland as James Warmington, the exact same part of Armagh as James Warmington is, but he's living there 32 years before James is born. And he seems to be the same Joseph Warmington who dies in 1773, leaving a will. The will is recorded, but the actual original does not exist. So there's a record of it existing, but in an index, but the actual document doesn't exist, which is really frustrating. But he dies in 1773. Interestingly, most transcriptions give the 1766 one as Josh Warmington, but when you actually look at the original document, it's a clear contraction of Joseph, which is why it's always important, even with official records, to not just look at the transcription, but to go back to the original record yourself. I think all of this is a major lesson, I feel, in really looking at original sources and really analysing your sources properly, whether it's oral histories, whether it's official records, not just taking transcriptions or oral histories at face value and really digging in. So this is kind of my point here, is just to really dig deep, but not to discount oral histories. So long as you're dealing with these histories properly, they can be really important. And we're going to go into how important now. So obviously, getting back to this point, DNA comes in handy. And of the 12 Warmington males who were around in that generation, there was one called Richard Warmington. And I have several DNA matches who descend from this Richard Warmington. So that tells us immediately that there is a DNA connection between James and Richard. And he lived between the 1790s and 1836. So he dies in 1836. And he was born around the same time as James. So there's a DNA connection there. So definitely something connects these two. So they're potentially brothers, if not cousins. Now, this orange line represents an oral history, because from research in this Richard Warmington, there are oral histories available online which his descendants have written, stating that he was the son of a Richard Warmington, who in turn had a brother called Joseph and a brother called David. So I've now made this line orange, and what that's telling us is that there's a Richard, son of a Richard, with siblings Joseph and David. I can't verify this is before records begin, but this is the oral history. And it talks of how these three brothers came over to Ireland from England and began to work the land there. Well, I know that they were farmers, so this is kind of fitting in quite nicely. Now, I've added this John Warmington in because I started to delve in to see, well, what can I find out about these? And I could verify that there was indeed a Richard Warmington a generation earlier, who I do have evidence for living in the area. He's a member of the local Orange Lodge. I've managed to verify that. And there's a Richard Warmington in the area who sets up he applies to be a teacher. I know that my James Warmington, born in 1798, was a teacher. So there's kind of a link there. He was operating in the same area and he's a teacher. So that's quite promising. There's, we've got a DNA link there, we've got an occupational link there, we've got a link in the area. He's definitely living in the same village, same parish. And then I come across a registry of deed, which really is the big collection that is of any hope to getting back into the 18th century with Irish research. And that talks about Richard Warmington, who had a brother called John Warmington, who is the son of a Joseph Warmington. And it's implied in the document that Joseph Warmington, the father, has passed away. So what we've got now is we've got an oral history that connects a Richard Warmington to his father Richard, and then a written document that connects that Richard to a father called Joseph, who of course would be old enough to be the Joseph who is around in the 1760s and 1770s. So we've now got a connection between that Richard and the Joseph at the top, and a DNA connection between me and that Richard. So James could be the brother of Richard. He could descend from John or Joseph or David, but we're not sure yet. Now, this is where another DNA match comes in handy, because I've got a DNA match from one of James Warmington's sons. I descend from his daughter. I've got a match with one of his son's descendants. And they've got their own oral history, okay? And I've given that as a green line. So this is their oral history. And this green line talks about James, who was a teacher and a farmer, being the son of a Joseph, who was also a teacher and a farmer and a parish clerk. In the same village in which Richard Warmington is a teacher. So let's just get our heads around that. We've got Richard Warmington, born in the 1790s, who's the son of a Richard from an oral history. We've got verified historical evidence that his father Richard is potentially this Richard who is a teacher. And then I've got an oral history from one of my cousins that tells me that my James is the son of a Joseph, who is also a teacher. To make things even better, this Richard is said to have had a brother called Joseph in their oral history. I think at this point, we'll never be 100% certain of the connection, but you can see by my colour coding, the oranges and the greens and the blacks with the official records, we're starting to piece together something that makes sense, and there is evidence scattered around that kind of implies that there's a truth here. We're never going to know for certain, but I think without that oral history pointing me in the right direction, it's a really useful source, and that oral history, along with everything else, is starting to build together this tree. And it talks about James having siblings called Margaret and Mary. So I looked into Margaret and Mary, and I did manage to find their marriage certificates because they were a little bit younger, and their father was called Joseph. So at that point, I kind of verified James, and James witnesses both the marriages, I believe, of his two sisters. So that's kind of verified now, and obviously there's a DNA connection. So at this point, I said, we're never going to know for certain whether this tree that I've got here is accurate, but I've colour-coded it in my actual notes. I have got a key as to what the different colours mean, what my sources are. The black line represents an actual connection in the written record. The other colours represent different oral traditions. I think at this point you need to start looking at how accurate the oral history is, and certainly looking at the oral history, the green oral history here from my own branch of the family. Most of the stories that you look at are correct, and the ones that aren't correct have got an element of truth to them, or they've got a story behind them. For example, they talk about how James's daughter Jane, they're not aware of her marrying. They haven't said she didn't marry, they just said they're not aware of her marrying. Well, I know that she did because she's my ancestor. But the reason why they weren't aware is because this is an oral history from the 1930s. She left Armagh for Mayo in the 1860s. So we're talking something that happened 70 years earlier. And she died very young in childbirth. So it makes perfect sense that the people living 70 years later didn't really remember Auntie Jane because she left home 70 years ago and she died quite young. So the fact that they weren't aware of what happened to her actually makes sense. And again, it tells a story. It's that rich context. It tells a story in and of itself. And then in other cases, there's kind of definitely an element of truth there. And it's broadly correct. Then they'll talk about there being a brother called James and a brother called Joseph, and that James was older, but in fact I know that Joseph was older based on written records. So the fact is there were two brothers called Joseph and James. They've got that right, but they've just got them the wrong way round. So there's an element of truth, and that is just where you have to be careful with oral histories, that they aren't always passed down correctly, but there's always an element of truth there in the record. And most interesting, actually, because James Wilmington's wife, I wanted to find out who she was. And I had found that James Wilmington married an Agnes Davis in 1833. I found this years ago, that an Agnes Davis in 1833 in Armagh. But I couldn't be sure because there's not a complete set of marriage records for the time that it was definitely my James. But it certainly made sense from the date of marriage and when his first child was born that could be them. But I couldn't be sure. Well, in this oral history, it talks about James Wilmington marrying the daughter of a Mr. Davison. So, again, he marries, I believe, Agnes Davis in 1833, and exactly 100 years later, this oral history is talking about him marrying a Davison. So you can kind of see in that 100 years how Davis could become Davison. Now, I'm not 100% sure that Agnes Davis is his wife, but now getting an oral history that is broadly correct, and even when it's not correct, it's almost there, you can kind of start to think, well, it is an extra source, maybe, it will never completely confirm it, but it's adding credence to that theory that is the marriage, because you can see how Davis could become Davison after 100 years, as someone's kind of passed it on or misremembered it. So, key takeaways. First of all, make contact with other cousins. They may have stories, recordings, or items like family Bibles, which record information not available anywhere else. I think you've seen from that tree on the previous slide that was mainly made up of stuff that I've heard from other people that's just not available online. It's not available in an archive. It's people's personal items, personal belongings, personal stories. And again, they're not always going to be 100% accurate in their own right, but they're going to add to this rich picture, this rich story that's going to point you in the right direction. I could have researched, and I did, to be fair, research all traceable Wilmingtons that I could find in the area, but actually having some names from an oral history helped me to kind of highlight certain things that I had found. I'd found those Richard Wilmington references, but that kind of helped me to sort of bring them in and put them in context. Consider the sources behind these and log accordingly in your own records. Logging and sourcing is really important. Again, I must do a video on that at another later date. Continue to prioritise official written documents where possible, though these can also be inaccurate, so just be careful there, but do prioritise them. And again, I'm going to leave you on that question. Could we be more open-minded to oral histories as a community? Because I think I've proven here that while it's really important that we are really careful in how we analyse sources, how we record things, making sure that everything is accurate. We're not making jumps, we're not jumping to conclusions, we're certainly evidencing things, and we're making it clear if things are theories by sourcing things properly, by making it clear if some things are theory, not publishing things publicly if we're not 100% sure about them, but at the same time not letting that high standard that we should hold ourselves to lead to us discounting oral histories. But I'd love to know what you think. Please do let me know in the comments below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. I look forward to speaking to you soon.